Friends, good evening. Welcome to the Cathedral and welcome to the first in our Lent series on the Psalms, which we've given the title, The Beauty of Holiness. It's wonderful to welcome you here this evening and to share this first evening with you. I'll introduce tonight's speaker in a moment. Just to say, though, that the format of the evening and of the next few evenings over the Mondays of Lent is that the speaker will speak, there will be a space for questions and answers, and then at about 8:30 we will wrap up here in the North Transept, and I hope many of you will want to join us in the choir for the beautiful late night act of worship of Compline. And at that point, please follow the direction of the stewards. In fact, at all times, follow the directions of the stewards, and they will see you safely into the choir so that we can offer Compline together. Now, tonight's speaker is Mark Oakley, who is the Dean of Southwark. When he was appointed to that role, a great cheer went up around the Church of England for very good reason. Mark is, I'm going to say all the things that he is formally. He's a former Canon Chancellor of our sister Cathedral of St. Paul's. He's a former Dean of St. John's College, Cambridge. He's a former Archdeacon, of all things, in the Diocese of Europe. And formally, and for all too brief a period, we were incumbents together in that part of God's vineyard that's known as the City of Westminster. More important than any of that, though, is that Mark is a peerless interpreter and illuminator of the faith through the medium of poets' voices. And that's why we've invited him to begin our series tonight. If you don't know his books, The Splash of Words and My Sour Sweet Days, then by the end of this evening, you will want to become acquainted with them, and maybe they will become part of your Lenten reading. I heartily commend them to you. He has been and remains a wise and always sane colleague in the Forest of Deans, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome him. Mark Oakley.
Well, thank you, Nick, very much indeed. It's very good to be here, and I thank you very much for your invitation to be part of this series, indeed to be the first in the series and sort of set the scene for what's coming. There's an old story that's told about a very holy monk whom the demons were very busy trying to tempt. Nothing worked, and they went over to a tree and they rested underneath. Suddenly their lord, the devil himself, saw them and asked why they were so tired. "It's that monk," they said. "We've tried everything on him. We've tempted him with money, with wine, with food. We've tempted him with women, with men. Nothing works." "Wait here," said the devil. He went over to the monk and whispered into his ear. Suddenly, the monk jumped up, tore off his cross, ripped up his habit, made a very rude gesture to heaven, and shouted an even ruder word to go with it, and stomped off. The demons were in awe. "What on earth did you say to him?" they asked the devil. "Oh, I just told him that his brother has been made Bishop of Alexandria. Well, we all have our limits, and an invitation to Salisbury Cathedral to offer a few thoughts on the Psalms was a lovely temptation that I couldn't resist, so thank you. The Psalms are, according to many polls, the most loved book of the whole Bible. And you'll be hearing lots of perspectives on them, how they lie at the heart of both Jewish and Christian worship and faith, a shared bond and blessing between our two communities. You'll hear how they are used daily, and you know this here, in Anglican worship, from settings sung in choir stalls to translations for worship bands. You'll hear, I should think, about the monastic life and how it is built on the scaffolding of reciting the Psalms, chanted often in such a way as if they are the lungs of the church, breathing as we are meant to. You'll learn how they can sometimes shock. Lots of teeth being smashed and babies being battered and so on. How they can sometimes go on a bit. Too many verses at evensong stopping me getting home in time for the news. You'll hear how they can amuse from time to time and get a snigger. Neither delighteth he in any man's legs, often gets a wink from a lay clerk. You'll hear how they can move and inspire. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. You'll probably hear how they bring hope at the end of a life. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. In other words, you'll be hearing how they are the biblical book for all seasons, for all the seasons of the human heart, from the hard winter of seeming absence of God, doubt, despair, desolation, to the autumn of gratitude. Remember, John Donne said, in heaven it is always autumn. His mercies are ever in their maturity. To the spring of fresh and hopeful praise and purpose, and to the summer of just enjoying being with God, soaking up his warmth, no matter what comes along. The Psalms are there for all the seasons of the human heart, and they are all there to be discovered afresh, explored, celebrated, and of course prayed. This is a great series that you have this Lent in which to dive deeper into all this. And I've been asked to kick off the series with a very general introduction. But before I do this, I want us to get something really fixed into our heads. Psalms are poems. And so before we look at the Psalms in general, I just want us to think for a minute or two about poetry and why it might be that the book of 150 ancient poems is the most loved book of all in the Bible. And I do this because I know that if you are told that the Psalms are poems, many of you will be put off instantly, because that word poetry is a bit scary for many people. It has bad memories of boredom or humiliation at school as you tried to understand or remember or recite a poem. And sometimes then you maybe have tried later in life to come back to poetry. You've gone into a bookshop, you've pulled off a poetry book, and you've opened it up and you've started to read and you've realised this is language but not as we know it, and there seems to be a hell of a lot of space on the page. You don't get many words for your money in this book, and then you do read it and it doesn't make much sense and you just slip it back on the shelf. And a lot of people have had that experience, I think, and there's a sense, I think, in many people that it's too much work for too little reward. That's a sort of general complaint that you can hear from people who say they don't like poetry. There's even a word for all this. It's called metrophobia, the fear of poetry. Not fear of London transport, but the fear of poetry. But I've spent over 30 years now trying to help people of faith understand that poetry is their native language. That when we talk about poetry, we're talking actually about a soul language, a way of crafting words that distills our experience into what feels like purer truth. And this is, I think, what the Irish poet Michael Longley meant, who's sadly just recently died, what he meant when he was asked, "Where do you get all your poems from, Mr. Longley? Amazing, where do you get them all from?" And he said, well, if I knew where poems came from, I'd go and live there. There's often a sense of homecoming in reading a poem. People will often say, won't they, when they're reading a book that they're enjoying, a novel that they're enjoying, they'll say, it's unputdownable. But I think a good poetry book is very putdownable, because you read a line and you have to put the book down. You're trying to catch up with what you've just read. It's come as a bit of a surprise, a shock, and you've got to appropriate this, and it's taking you off into a new landscape. And the way I often put it is that the unforeseen suddenly has become the indispensable. So a good poetry book should be very putdownable. Auden, W.H. Auden, once said that poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings. And that is very evident in the Psalms, as you'll be discovering over the coming weeks. I suppose, like going on holiday, part of the fun of poetry is being lost. You know, no matter how you plan to go on holiday, no matter how much prep you do, how much Googling you do, actually part of the fun of going somewhere abroad is just knowing you're going to be a bit lost and confused from time to time. And that is part of the fun. And I think it's the same with poetry. You just have to accept that and hang around with the poem for a while. You will be confused by poetry often. As I say, this is language that's gone to the gym. It's acrobatic language. And you are allowed, by the way, not to like it. But here's the spiritual point. Difficulty can often be a very important thing in a life. If you look back at your lives, you probably can see that the most important times were often the difficult ones. The point of crisis is often the point of truth. And as in life, so in the language of life, people will often say, I can't understand it. I don't know what the meaning is, as if there is the meaning. That if only you were bright enough, if only you'd been to that fabulous college in Cambridge, you'd be able to excavate away and find the one true meaning of this poem. That is completely wrong. Instead of thinking like that, I often think it's better to think of a piece of music. If I played a piece of music to you now and said, tell me what that meant, you'd go, that's a bit of an odd question. What we'd do instead is start to talk about our response to the music, what it's done to us, where it's taken us. And I think we have to do the same with poetry. So not what does it mean, but what is it doing to me? What's my response? And this is why Geoffrey Hill, the great poet of the 20th century, said there is a democracy to poetry. Each of us has our own response that is valid to it. And the beauty, of course, of reading poems together is that we read the poem and then you have a response and you have a response and I have a response and you have and we start to pile them up and we end up with one enormous response that not one of us had to begin with. And the wonderful thing about poetry, as somebody once said, is you can never finish a poem, you can only ever abandon it. So just before I move on to these poems that we're looking at in these weeks, a quick exercise that if I suddenly said to you, here is the news, you'd probably sit up and expect to hear the facts of the day, events that have occurred, the latest thing Trump's just done, some commentary on all that. And you'd tune your ears in for the BBC, for the news. But instead, if I said to you, once upon a time, you'd probably be equally expectant for truth, actually, but you'd be tuning in differently now because you're ready to receive it in a different form. You're ready to receive a story where meaning is communicated without summarizing it. We like stories. Children love them. Now, when you walk into this cathedral or any place of worship, how are your ears tuned? Are they tuned for the newsroom, the BBC, for Google? Is this a great big Google temple of facts on tap? Or, as I think, when you walked into here, you've walked into a poem. You've walked into a space that's celebrating the fact that God is not an object of our knowledge. God is the cause of our wonder. And you see, to walk in with expectations, if you've got your news ears tuned in, you're going to get very frustrated because what comes at you when worship begins is poetry in motion. And it leads to a lot of people getting very frustrated because they think that they're waiting for truth to come in one form and they're getting it in another. It's a sort of category error, and it causes a lot of frustration. But if you think what's happening when worship starts, and you can test this out later after this talk, but it is poetry in motion because we normally stand and sing a poem, which we call a hymn or a worship song. And then you'll hear an ancient poem called a psalm. And then you'll have prayers which are full of images and metaphors and similes. And if you're a high church cleric or a charismatic singer, even your gestures become poetic. The body goes into poetry. Arms go into the vocative as a language is sought to praise the mystery and reality of God. And if you think just for a moment about your own life again, about when you fall in love, and there may be people out there as I look at you now who are deeply in love with someone. I can see one or two ruddy faces. Perhaps you're in love. But if you remember the language you use when you're in love, the last thing you are is a literalist. When we fall in love, when we're in love, we're looking for a language that is going to express what we feel, and we will go to every length to describe the loved one and our feelings for the loved one. We all become poets as we scurry around trying to do justice to the reality of who we are in relation to them. And I say we take language to the gym to do a bit of a workout to get fitter for purpose. So poetry is certainly the language of the lover, the language of love, and that simply is why it has to be the language of the church, the language of faith, love of God, love of neighbor. So sometimes there are things that are far too important to be merely literalistic about. And as I used to say to students to wind them up, fundamentalism is to Christianity what paint by numbers is to art. So, when you open the book of Psalms, it is just like opening an anthology of poems. They are a collection of unconnected verses that differ in style, in subject matter, in emotional intensity, and in purpose. They aren't poems that are intimately related, so you haven't got to find the thread that's linking them all together. There isn't one, particularly. They are, of course, when they're read in English, poems that are in translation from the Hebrew. So some of the original poetic forms and sounds are lost, and maybe next week, I think it is, when you have a rabbi with you, you'll hear more about the original language of the Psalms. Because, well, translating poetry is not an easy thing. I always think it's like boiling strawberries. You're left with something of the colour and taste, but it's a bit of a different dish. A good example of how translations differ would be Psalm 12, verse 4. The New Revised Standard Version translates it as, "Our lips are our own. Who is our master?" Two other translations in Bibles say, however, "We will say what we wish and no one can stop us." And another, "With words as our ally, who can master us?" But the New International Version rather startlingly offers, "Our lips are our plowshares." You're getting the drift that trying to translate isn't always easy. And instead of the New Revised Standard Version's translation of Psalm 58:7, "Like grass let them be trodden down and wither," the Revised English Bible provides, "May he aim his arrows, may they perish by them." And the New International Version says, "When they draw the bow, let their arrows be blunted." But I think the worst is the distance between that, the New Revised Standard Version's translation of Psalm 77:4. So the New Revised Standard Version says this, "You keep my eyelids from closing." The Good News Bible translates that as, "You keep me awake at night," as if God was a rather bad case of indigestion. Some psalms are very short, like 117. Some, like its neighbour, 119, seem endless. Some, like 139, are intensely personal. "Lord, you have searched me out and known me." And others, such as 2, deal with matters of failing international politics. Why are the nations in turmoil? Why do the peoples hatch their futile plots? Psalm 146 ponders the nature of God. "The Lord feeds the hungry and sets the prisoner free." Whilst 8 reflects on human fallibility. "What is a frail mortal that you should be mindful of him?" 92 expresses deep faith. "It's good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name most high." 88 sounds a bit different. "You have taken friend and neighbour far from me. Darkness is now my only companion." Trying to work out who is speaking to whom isn't always easy. Most often, a believer or doubter is addressing God. "Lord, out of the depths I have called to you." But sometimes the author is addressing, if not a live audience, then a local or national community. "Hear this, all you peoples. Listen, all you inhabitants of the world." There are occasions when the author seems to be taking down words that God is dictating. "Listen, my people, and I shall speak. I shall bear witness against you, Israel. I am God, your God. Because of all this, St. Augustine, who wrote a great deal about the Psalms, said that the Psalms voice earth to heaven and heaven to earth. Sometimes it sounds as if the author is addressing neither God nor humanity, but the company of heaven. Ascribe to the Lord, you angelic powers. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. In others, it's as if the author is musing internally or aloud, but not speaking to any third party. Though I walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil. So we don't come to the Psalms expecting everyone is going to warm our spiritual cockles and be talking about God's love for me. Some of them are going to be much trickier. Some of them won't immediately attract you. Some need a bit of research even. But all of them are expressing part of this shadow play of a pilgrimage that we know as a human life. So with that as background, celebrating the truth, as I often put it, it's not my phrase, it's the phrase of the Australian poet Les Murray, that God is in the world as poetry is in the poem. Let's just explore what we know about the Psalms as a general introduction. What we have, as I say, is a miscellaneous collection of Hebrew poems of many sorts. The majority are prayers to God, either by an individual or a group, and are often classified as laments, although in some cases petitions might be a better term. Hear my prayer, O Lord, let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me on the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. These prayer poems may be made in the name of an individual or of the collective Israel. So we often hear scholars talk of individual laments or communal laments. Sometimes it's a bit more complicated than that because they move from one to the other in one poem. And some people think that that's just how it's meant to be, and some people think that actually over time two poems have been forged into one. And if you're excited about those sort of questions, then you become a scholar of the Psalms, and that's how you earn your salary, dealing with such questions. Walter Brueggemann has met with quite acclaim for dividing the Psalms into three basic types, as represented by the general tone of the texts. So he says there are psalms of orientation, psalms of disorientation, and psalms of reorientation. Students love that. You just learn it and replay it. At this point, it might be helpful to touch on this word lament, because it's a word that's going to pop up, I think, over the next few weeks. Lament is a spiritual discipline. Biblically, especially in about a third of the Psalms, lament is a formal, structured expression of sorrow or mourning or complaint. So Psalm 13, for instance, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts day after day and have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? You find complaints in the Psalms like that, but also complaints about bodies not working too well, disease, disappointments, depression, dangerous liars, bad people who are doing better than the good people. And sometimes God is the cause of lament directly. He's unresponsive or acting oddly. Is he answering any of those letters we keep sending him? Jesus, of course, knew and prayed the Psalms and the Psalms of lament. And it is often thought that he, on the cross, was, as a good Jew, reciting the Psalms on the cross to the God who seems to have deserted him. My God, why have you forsaken me? Straight from the Psalms. And yet, of course, into God's hands he commends himself, also in words from the Psalms. The idea of Jesus on the cross reciting the Psalms, I always find profoundly moving. Hebrews tells us that Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. And of course, you know, in the Anglican Church, with our sanitized liturgies, we don't always allow lament in that way. A recent study of contemporary hymnals concluded that only about 4% of hymns today reflect the kind of lament that's modelled in the Psalms. That sort of fist up to heaven saying, where the bloody hell are you, God? You know, we're Anglicans, we don't talk like that to God. The serious issue with that is that it renders the sufferer voiceless. It limits the sufferer into saying things they don't really want to. You're buttering up God when actually you're a bit frustrated. And I suppose by reading the Psalms and praying the Psalms, we are reclaiming a bit of our, what you might call our barefaced integrity. We want to get our pain and our honesty out a little bit more. And the Psalms of Lament, as I say, about a third of them, tend to have a sort of structure to them. They have an address to God, a complaint or a request, and then a motivation. You're sort of telling God why he should act. You know, you don't seem to be doing much, so can I just have a word? And then you sort of try and twist the arm of God a bit in your dialogue with God. And then they end with a renewed confidence in God. It's restored. And scholars note that the lament psalms do their work of helping people to die completely to an old situation, the old possibilities, the old false hopes, the old lines of defense, and say, as it were, that's all over now. So the Psalms are liminal. They're helping you from one old landscape into a new, but you can't just nip on a bus. You've got to start being honest and voicing new thoughts and sometimes difficult things. But as long as you're doing it, the journey's taking place. And you will end up, and this is how the Psalms do end up, in a place of restoration. So the Psalms, if they are used in this way, and scholars will say this is the effect of the Psalms, are helping people's inner life cope with difficulty and change because of the way they're structured in a lament. And in praying through lament, a few things are happening. So first, by expressing the feelings and experience of suffering, it begins to restore some sense of order. You know, when everything's chaos, as soon as you start to try to give voice to it, at least some order seems to be coming into the picture. Secondly, it allows that suffering to be expressed interpersonally, bringing it into relationship. You're not just with it yourself. Praying lament addresses God, and your hurt is brought into the relationship with him. It doesn't just stagnate in you. And the covenant with God is respected, and it's not made into a false relationship with one side only saying nice things and therefore not being themselves. And then thirdly, it helps us as we struggle for the words to hear ourselves, to excavate what's lying deep behind all our masks, you know, our religious masks that we put on for God on a Sunday morning. You know, what lies behind that, and has your mask started to eat into your face? What happens with you and God when you try to pull that off? And the Psalms are saying, actually, maybe I need to, and maybe God needs to help me. Walter Brueggemann will talk about the Psalms helping us see what he calls the subversion of reality, so the reading between the lines. So he often thinks that reading the Psalms is a subversion to our status quo. We're trying to read God between the lines of our life and to help God, to ask God to help us become, not just be, but to become. And that means, of course, some difficulty. So to find the words is more important than we might realize. It means as we give voice, so nothing is off limits. Suffering, confusion, emotional chaos have to be recognized for what they are. And the way out of suffering is through it. You can't go round it. You have to go through it. And that's the voice of the Psalms. Come through with your pain. And in all this, the importance of lament is this, that it is acting as a bridge between your old world and your new world. And this is why Brueggemann calls it disorientation to a new orientation. It's a holding language, a liminal one. And it's only by crying, as it were, that I can sense that there might be a new beginning. And of course you find this later again in the Duns and the Herberts, where tears are a gift from God, washing out yourself. Lament is the way towards hope, but we need help with it, and the Psalms are the help. And if all that interests you, Brueggemann is your man. But in his commentary on the Psalms, another scholar called Arthur Weiser preferred to clarify them into three dominant types, the Psalms, and two supplementary ones. He said, I think there are hymns, laments, and thanksgivings. There are a few blessings and curses, and there's a bit of wisdom. Those were his five. So as you can see, people are always trying to categorize the Psalms, but they always slightly escape the net. It never quite does. What all these do, however, at the end of the day, is remind us that we're not dealing with homogeneous material, and we shouldn't approach them in the same way or expect them to evoke the same response. Each psalm is its own little world. By the way, we don't know who wrote all these psalms. Some think King David did. Some think he wrote some of them. Some think that's a lovely tradition, but it's a very doubtful one. One or two clearly presuppose the exile. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Others, such as Psalm 72, imply that there's still a king on a throne. But, most come from a variety of periods in the history of Israel. And they could have been produced by scribes, by temple singers, or other poets whose role in society is unknown to us. So we don't know who wrote these. What about their use? How were they used? Well, there's little evidence in the Bible for this, although Chronicles says that they were sung in the temple during worship. Even if the laments were used in the temple, they were probably not sung communally. We shouldn't imagine congregational singing like Cum Ronda, or even a very large choir. The individual lament psalms were probably performed by an individual, not necessarily by the sufferers themselves, but more likely by a professional lamenter. Jeremiah tells us that there were mourning women who would sing a dirge over the deceased. Were the psalms written for use in worship? We don't know. Salisbury, of all places, will know how lyric poems designed for private consumption are sometimes used in worship. Think of George Herbert. Likewise, hymns intended for corporate singing can be used in private prayer, like Luther's hymns. There's just no way of telling, really. Given a bare text with no indications of intended use or the context, what the original purpose of these psalms was. Certainly there are psalms of thanksgiving. How they were used, we don't know. But make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Again, it's possible to imagine a group using a psalm that speaks of by a single worshipper who's speaking on behalf of a community, but we just don't know. A number of psalms are not directed to God in lament or praise at all, but are sort of teaching-type psalms. They start to sound a bit like Ecclesiastes. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers. They've got this sort of wisdom code to it, like a good teacher is sitting you down. And sometimes you get, like Psalm 119, which is a bit of an odd animal. Psalm 119 is actually an acrostic, but a very complicated one. So in each of the 22 sections of this very long psalm, each of the 8 verses begins with the same letter of the alphabet. Thus there's an Aleph section, there's a Beth section, and so on, all the way to the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's hard not to think that this was written for reading rather than for singing. So it's like an extended meditation on the beauty of the Torah, the law. And every line contains a synonym for the Torah: statutes, judgments, testimonies, and so on. So again, another different form of a psalm that doesn't sound as if it was sung, but was all sort of meditated on. Some think 119, by the way, is really boring psalm. C.S. Lewis, however, thought it a thing of true beauty. He said it was the Hebrew equivalent of a perfect sonnet. Anyway, we don't really know what these psalms were used for and how they were used. But finally, what about the order of the Psalms? Well, the complete book of Psalms, called the Psalter, can scarcely have come into existence before 300 BC, since there are individual psalms in it that are probably no earlier than the late Persian period, which ended with Alexander the Great's conquests. Everything suggests that the growth of the Psalter was immensely complicated. As it stands, it is rather like the Pentateuch or the Torah, divided into 5 books, but the divisions don't correspond to breaks in theme or sense. It's a rather artificial separation. However, though not captured in the sections, the Psalms do have discernible themes. So if you're reading the Psalms, you're going to be reading about creation, God and Israel, prosperity and suffering, the nature of God, God and David, Jerusalem, and the Torah. Those are the themes that are always in the air. So time is short, and I apologize for this gallop through these introductory themes that others are going to take up in more detail through your series. But what I ask as you listen through this series over the next coming weeks is, please don't forget the poetry, nor forget the work that a psalm might be doing in the inner landscape to help you reorientate your life through some acknowledgement of rupture or pain or doubt. The psalm acts as a sort of poetic compass, always pointing north, though your ship is rocking everywhere. So let's end by listening to one psalm and hear the poetry. Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. They shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under foot. Because he hath set his love upon me, therefore will I deliver him. I will set him on high, because he hath known my name. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him, and with long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. Thank you.
I know that Mark is willing to take questions, so I urge you to raise a hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Here we are, Chris.
That old question that traps every vicar. Which translation should you use? Well, I've just read, of course, the one that you'll find in the old prayer book, because I do find them beautiful. I love the resonances and rhythms of that. Rhythm, of course, is such an important part of the Psalms. I talked about them being the lungs of the church. And there is something about recitation that is very natural to the body. So I often have to remind people of this, that you've all got what we call an iamb, a T-tum going on in you. Each of you, at least I hope each of you's got a little rhythm going on in you now. T-tum, T-tum, T-tum. And if you take one breath, how many T-tums can I get in that? T-tum, 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 T-tum. 5. You have 5 T-tums or 5 iambs, which is iambic pentameter. And that is the main line of rhythm in most English language poetry. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Butter my heart, 3-person God for you. And so there's both the heartbeat and the breath caught up in this seemingly ordinary rhythm that we use in English language poetry. So, it's a long way of saying, I like to hear the rhythm of the words, and I think that some of the older translations have that. However, day by day, I use the ones from the New Revised Standard Version, which I think are perfectly acceptable and rather beautifully done. I've been turned off, it must be 8:30. I wouldn't go to the Good News Bible as I just, you keep me up at night. Yeah, but those are the two that I tend to work with most, yeah.
So who was it? Yeah, I think in a way my question's been asked of you. Because, I love the Old Testament, and one of the main things is the poetry, and it's on beyond the Psalms. And so I was glad what you said about the RSV, because I've stuck with that yesterday. And one reason is for me is the poetry and the way they put forth the words and the words, because some of these very modern versions I find even the prose is too prosaic, so what they then go on to do with the poetry doesn't bear considering for too long. But yes, I think I have to also be aware of poetry throughout the Old Testament and the importance of portraying what is being said through the medium of poetry. The Psalms are the most obvious, of course.
Yeah, and the prophets use a lot of poetry to show people who they've become and why they might need to do a U-turn. I think there's a lot of stress sometimes in the church, and I say this to people who are learning how to preach. There's a lot of talk about relevance, and I say, well, I think it would be better if you tried to focus on resonance. There's a difference. Relevance is something that's here now, probably gone tomorrow. Resonance is trying to voice and connect with something that is perennial in you because you're a human being. So I think when you're trying to be resonant in preaching, you're trying to find those things which are not just about the here and now. And I would like to hear the resonance, I think, in a translation. There's something of a depth, a significance to it, rather than just trying to, find words that you'd put on a fridge magnet.
Chris.
Have you got
I've been asked, just in case you can't hear, about whether I've got a favourite poem and whether the one that I might like poetically is the one that's also reaching me spiritually and so on, and emotionally. I think for me those three things are always caught up together. It depends on my mood, which is why I came up with that idea about it being a book for all seasons. So there are some days where, I'm sure you'll never like this, Nick, but I feel like I'm a bit of a grumpy dean this morning, and I'm rather fed up with the Church of England, and frankly, I just don't know what I'm doing, and why have I got to go to another 16 committees, and what's that got to do with being all that stuff, which I'm sitting there, and I read the Psalms, and you just get that sense of complaint. And that psalm for that day will be one of my favorites. And then there are some, and that's why I'm looking forward to Compline. I often think psalms at Compline are some of the most beautiful. I won't spoil it for you, but I do think and they are intensely personal. And it's almost like a lullaby in that instance. It's making me want to nod off with God. Or as Herbert said, more than in bed, I rest in your love more than in my bed. And there's a sense of that you get in some of the Psalms. And so I think the Compline Psalms, 1, 2, 1, and so on, are probably my favourites.
Thank you very much.
Mark, you've spoken eloquently about the Psalms enabling us to express all our feelings, not just the acceptable ones, but how we're really feeling deep down. And we know that there are Psalms which express really shocking things, like battering babies against the rocks. And I'm wondering how you feel about what we can use in public worship. And, because there are things that we edit, aren't there? You know? and just how you feel about
Yeah,
that.
they're often left out, aren't they? Sometimes. Do you leave out the difficult verses? Yeah. I think there's a very good reason for doing that, because quite often the people that are coming into cathedrals particularly are visitors who have no sense of the context. But I also think this about some of the biblical readings we give them. And, you know, time is short and we can't sort of say, now just before we sing this psalm, I'd just like to give you 40 minutes on the nature of lament. And, you know, they're just sitting listening to it and they're suddenly hearing, oh, I hate my enemy and I'd love to stick one in the eye and, you know, bash his babies while I'm at it. That's not great. So I can see why we think, maybe we'll edit that. There's another side of my brain that says, but that's also part of us, isn't it? There is that anger, and we're all sort of compressing it a bit. There's a lot of absorption in church. Clergy do a lot of absorbing people's feelings and angers, and church absorbs a lot and doesn't let it all out. And the Psalms are saying, what would happen if we did? Might it all be a bit more honest? So there is a bit of my brain that says, actually, let's do the difficult bits. But I think for the average weekday evensong with tourists and so on, I would probably be agreeing with that. You take them out.
Last question, I think.
Yeah.
Do you have any, and that sort of leaves me feeling glum for quite, sorry, that leaves me feeling glum quite a while. They're particularly Lenten. Do you have any antidotes?
To the glum psalm.
To the glumness. They're very important in the sense of what you say about resonance, but sometimes I just need an antidote. And, you know, I love the 23rd Psalm, but other than that, do you have any suggestions?
Well, I always think, stick with the tone of the psalm. So if it's glum, you know, just bring out your inner Eeyore, you know, because Tigger's round the corner, because you're going to get the canticle, the gospel canticle, which will either be the Magnificat, which is my soul, you know, gives, or it's going to be the Benedictus, which is also a thing of great beauty and hope. So I think in itself the office of morning and evening prayer is also taking you on that, you know, allows you to be a bit glum and complaining and the shadows come in. But I don't think it leaves you there. I think it's saying, you know, let's carry on. So I think that's the antidote. I think it's sort of in there. But I can see how you might be still stuck with thinking about that psalm and what effect it's had on you, but maybe that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
We need to draw to a close. My favourite psalm verse, the one that applies most pertinently to me, is the verse that says, "My confusion is daily before me." But Mark, tonight, and I suspect in the weeks ahead, some of the confusion is going to clear because of the resonance with which you have addressed us tonight. You have set us a context and you have tuned our ears, and we're ready for what Lent has to offer us through these wondrous poems. So, from all of us, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Please, if you're able, come and join us for worship and for the office of Compline in the choir. Follow the directions of the stewards.